It's victory to the Plagued Legions of the Death Guard today, with some Mortarion sons putting out some rather spectacular results over the last weekend or so. Let's talk through 4 strong army lists and what top players are using to deliver victory for Nurgle. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Death Guard, and in this video I thought we'd go over some successful army lists to see what's working out best for the faction at the moment in game. In the video we'll talk briefly about Death Guard in general, then talk through 4 top tournament lists that have gone undefeated in major events, and for each one take a look at just a couple of key units and datasheets and how they fit into the overall army. In 10th edition at the moment, I'd say that broadly Death Guard are in a fairly good spot compared with where they were. At the start of 10th, Games Workshop gave them a rather underpowered index that was one of the very weakest factions in the game, but between a fairly interesting and cool buff to the contagions of Nurgle, plus some very big points decreases, it now seems that armies are doing okay power-wise at least, winning around about 48% of tournament games, and managing to top their fair share of events. 5 big tournament wins since the balanced data slate came out. Though some units are perhaps a bit on the underpowered side, and the faction maybe feels just a little bit less elite than you might expect for Death Guard, I feel like they're in a better place than a lot of armies out there in the game. Most units at least being usable, and some fun buffs to their contagions of Nurgle, like the extra AP -1 if they're within contagion range, or making enemies -1 to hit, on top of the more stock effect of the -1 toughness. For units that tend to see a lot of play in top tournament lists at the moment though, there are some things that just really stand out as pretty much staples in the majority of lists. Plagueburst crawlers tend to be taken in multiples in the vast majority of top armies, solid in direct fire, plus being fairly tough and backed up by some big cannons. They're certainly kind of conspicuous in these lists as every single one chose to take 3 of the things, seemingly not a unit that you can take too much of. Deathshroud Terminators tend to turn up with a lot of regularity led by their Terminator characters, often sorcerers or the Lord of Contagion, but the Lord of Virulence and Typhus are both good as well. Plague Marines are pretty solid, usually jumping out of Rhinos alongside some of the Feet of Virion members, things like the Biologist Putrefier or maybe the Foul Blightspawn. And another big common factor in a lot of these Death Guard lists are some allied Nurglings jumping in as well. 35 points for cheap little distraction deep strikers are all well and good. They can just turn up and do secondary objectives, or even just start on the midfield if you desperately need to screen out enemy infiltrators or something. Plenty of other choices are fine though. Typhus perhaps plus or minus the Poxwalkers, or the Demon Engine support, and Mortarion are all pretty usable. For the most iconic units, I feel like maybe the one thing that's conspicuously absent in the vast majority of competitive lists are the Blightlord Terminators. They do just seem so much worse than Deathshroud point for point. Just seems that you don't really pay all that much more for the Deathshroud being some actually quite dangerous damage dealers compared with the Blightlord guys. Overall though, perhaps not too bad a situation for budding Plague Marines out there. Jumping into the army list, let's take a look at 4 different ones to see how different people are winning with the faction. And first up I thought we'd start with this list by Aidan Smalley, using it to take first at Gravel Pit GT. Notably, I believe he was the player who achieved one of Death Guard's only good tournament performances while they were at their weakest, and perhaps was only robbed of victory by the Eldari player with the weighted dice at that event, so cool to see him having some success with the new reincarnated Death Guard. This list doesn't include Mortarion, but is really quite character heavy otherwise. 3 Terminator characters, Typhus who apparently runs solo, a Lord of Contagion and a Terminator Sorcerer. Deadly Pathogen gives you +1 strength and +1 attack, so a bit more melee power. +2 to both if they're on an infected objective marker, and allows reroll hit rolls for the units, and the Terminator Sorcerer takes the droning for some battle shock mortal wounds handed out within contagion range, and is otherwise just quite a nice support character with some big hitting psyche attacks among other things. Apparently Typhus can run solo to do things like secondaries and stuff. He's at least fairly tanky on his own I suppose, and a lot of his value comes from his mortal wound attack, plus he's fairly fighty if he drops in the backfield I guess to cause the opponent problems. Then the list also goes really quite Plague Marine heavy as well compared with plenty of others. It looks like there's 3 Rhinos in total, 1 big squad of 10 Plague Marines and then 2 squads of 5. They go heavy on plasma guns and blight launchers, and then both the 10-man squad and 2 of the 5-mans go quite heavy on the heavy plague weapons as well, 5 in the big one and 3 in the little ones. I'm not sure of the exact character attachments, but they're joined by some Biologist Putrefiers, which we'll take a look at in a second. Cheap 50-point characters with some nasty close range damage, and the Foul Blightspawn for the fight first. I guess he might be joining the big squad I suppose. It could make them very hard to charge for certain enemies if they can't fight before they get hit. Then there's the ubiquitous 3 Plagueburst Crawlers. They take the heavy sluggers along with 2 entropy cannons, and 1 takes the plague spitters for maybe being a bit more adventurous and some nasty anti-infantry overwatch. And there's 2 units of 3 allied nurglings, excellent for either screening or dropping to do secondaries. In order, it looks like the list took down World Eaters, then Tyranids Unending Swarm, Necrons, and then interestingly enough 2 Blood Angels Ironstorm lists. Kind of an interesting combination to come up twice in a row there. Overall, it looks pretty nasty, loads of big threats at close range there. The Deathshroud potentially could use rapid ingress if it made sense. The Plague Marines with those Putrefiers are utterly lethal at close range and have some high objective control for the midfield objectives as well. To focus in on a couple of units, here's the Biologist Putrefier coming up 3 times in Mr. Aiden's list. He can make Plague Marines enormously scary for just 50 points. He makes their lethal hits go off on a 5+, so that means they're auto-wounding a whole load of things in the game very easily indeed, both at range and in melee. And in melee they could even use that Sanguous Flux stratagem for 1 CP to gain sustained hits too if they're near an objective marker. That could be pretty massive if you're getting critical hits on a 5+ anyway. Otherwise, he gets a once per game 0 CP grenade stratagem, so a few more mortal wounds thrown around when it's been jumping out of the Rhino, and has a bit of shooting threat in himself with the close range Hyper Blight grenades, an extra d6 attacks at strength 5 and damage 2 don't hurt. Games Workshop do seem to have decreased the points cost of Plague Marines to the point where they're seen as really quite effective now, only 80 points per 5 of these, and they get to pick up really quite a lot of fancy gear. Often the main decisions seem to be between weighing up things like heavy plague weapons versus plasma guns and blight launchers for the primary choices. Either way, for 16-point Marines they are perhaps surprisingly threatening for their points cost, even if despite being toughness 5 they aren't really enormously more tough than any other standard Marines out there, and they're usually fielded jumping out of Rhinos to make up for their slightly slow movement. On to our next list though, and for the second big winning Death Guard list for the weekend, this one was by Garrett Stacey, who used it to take first at Rumble on the Rivers GT. Again, over 50 players in the tournament and going 5-0 with 5 big wins. This list is really quite an interesting one. It's got Mortarion, 3 Wardog Brigands allied, and a bunch of individual Terminator Sorcerers, in addition to the Plagueburst Crawlers and a bunch of Marines and Rhinos. The individual Terminator Sorcerers are kind of interesting, I think. I guess they are 70-point models that have some pretty serious threat just in their own right. For their first round of shooting, they're likely to be getting 2d6 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3, which is pretty punchy. And they're harder to kill than you might expect in melee, given that they have a good chance to get -1 damage. Otherwise, Mortarion's 325 points, fairly cheap and nice and tough for his cost. His Ignores Modifiers aura can be interesting for the Plagueburst Crawlers. I believe unless you're playing by Games Workshop's maybe slightly questionable Atlanta FAQ thing, that means they get to ignore any penalties to their characteristics as per the barrage rules, so they'd be hitting a lot more accurately than they would be otherwise. Then the Plague Marines in this list don't have any supporting Virion characters, but they go heavy on the Plague weapons, so fairly combat capable there with a bunch of strength 8 and damage 2 hits. The Plagueburst Crawlers here all take Entropy Cannons for some extra anti-tank punch, and the Wardog Brigands I think are really quite an interesting choice. Allied Chaos Knights with the 2+ ballistic skill, volume fire from the chain cannon, and the anti-tank thermal spear. I'd guess that perhaps the idea of the list might be to go for the extra AP contagion, and then if you can spread that contagion to enemy units that you're about to shoot, the Brigands might be extra nasty with, I believe, anywhere up to AP3 minus chain cannons. They could also chip into the fight with Havoc launchers for even more indirect fire. Overall really quite interesting, with some seriously scary looking Death Guard firepower, and interesting Terminator Sorcerers for disruption and maybe doing secondary objectives and things. One of them taking Living Plague adds an extra 3-inch to their Nurgle's Gift Contagion range, so I guess that could be quite a nice way of handing out the extra AP for all the indirect fire, I suppose. Mortarion maybe doesn't seem to be in auto-include territory like Angron or Magnus of the Thousand Suns, but at 325 points I still think is very playable. You get a massive amount of tough wounds with toughness 12, 16 wounds, a 4+ invulnerable and a 5+ feel no pain. He is going to eat a lot of fire for his points investment, and his melee is still fairly capable of taking down most normal size units in the game, even if maybe it wasn't quite as utterly devastating as it might have been in previous editions. He can either hand out the benefit of cover to nearby Death Guard units nearby, or mean that they get to reroll wound rolls of 1, a nice damage buff which again might help the Plagueburst Crawlers I suppose, and likely wants to be moving towards the midfield objectives in the mid to late game perhaps to get his combat presence on the table and taking points. His Ignores Modifiers rule would definitely be helpful for the Plagueburst Crawlers in this list. The Plagueburst too seem to be pretty much everywhere at the moment, shooting the enemy down with d6 plus 3 shots with their Plagueburst Mortars, strength 8, AP -1 and damage 2 with lethal hits. Quite a good general purpose profile that's likely to stack some damage on most things, and perhaps particularly on anything that you can get the AP-1 extra contagion off on. That'd counteract the cover that enemies can get, and beyond that they're still fairly tough with a 2+ armor save, and have some nice anti-tank weapons with the entropy cannons, each with strength 10 and damage d6+1. Between all that, they seem to be really quite solid little battle tanks for the Death Guard, and can even chip in a little bit on objectives with movement of 10 inches and objective control of 4. Could be useful in the later game. Sticking with some very heavy Demon Engine action, and the third list today was won by Vincent Chan, placing third overall at the Coventry Super Major for the 2-day event. Looks like 88 players played the entire thing through, and the list overall went 5-0, so basically undefeated alongside another couple at the top. This one looked like it faced down a whole bunch of meta lists, Grey Knights to start with, but then Chaos Knights, Orcs, World Eaters and Eldari. That seems like a pretty rough run to try and get to the top, so pretty impressive to get all those wins there. This list seems to be all about the massive Death Guard armour. Again, there's the standard 3 Plagueburst crawlers, but this one also uses 2 Mephitic Blight haulers with the close range anti-elite infantry sort of firepower, 2 feated bloat drones taking the heavy blight launchers, and kind of interestingly 3 Predator Destructors which haven't seen loads of people running. They are maybe a little bit better in Death Guard than some other places though, as they get the Plague Heavy Bolters with the lethal hits which lots of other factions don't get. Then there's a Rhino with 1 squad of 5 Plague Marines with 2 plasma guns, a blight launcher and a heavy plague weapon. They're attached to a Biologist Putrefier for some big grenade damage if they need it. And then there's a couple of Terminator characters, Typhus and a Lord of Virulence, each seemingly leading a squad of Deathshroud Terminators for their -1 to wound. The Lord of Virulence would be pretty excellent for coordinating the Plagueburst mortar fire. He gets to give them a +1 to hit, and also ignores cover, so basically counteracts the indirect fire penalties for them if he can see the target. There's also a single allied Nurgle swarm for secondaries and things, I guess. Overall, really quite cool to see near full armoured Death Guard, just with a couple of Terminator units in support. 10 big chunky plague vehicles of one sort or another here. This one's certainly going to have more damage than some of the lists out there, but might be a little bit harder to coordinate secondary objectives and things. There's maybe not a lot of wiggle room or redundancy if the opponent does manage to take out objective holders. Kind of goes without saying that it must have been played very well to achieve this sort of success against the armies it matched against. For the Terminator characters, Typhus definitely seems to appear in his fair share of these lists. He's 100 points and is just an all-round efficient datasheet. Pretty good defense for a character with 6 wounds, toughness 6 and a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable. And really quite big melee that's similar to the Lord of Contagion but with strength 9 on the Mastercrafted Man Reaper swing. He gives a -1 to hit for his unit if he happens to be leading one, and he can choose to lead either Poxwalkers or Terminators if he wants, or even just run solo. Though perhaps the single most reliable bit of value he brings to the game is his Eater Plague psychic power, nominating one unit within 18 inches, and on a 2+ he gets to deal out a big D3+3 mortal wounds to that unit. Against the right target, that could easily be over 50 points worth of dead models just in one shot there, never mind if he goes on to fight or gets to use it again. Finally, here's just a list that I mentioned on the channel the other week, alongside a few other armies from sort of mid-tier factions that have been punching up really quite well. This one was run by Piers Condren, who used it to take first at GaleCon, a 30-player 5-round tournament, again going 5 wins to 0 losses. Looks like he had to beat 2 flavours of Space Marines, then Guard World Eaters and Chaos Space Marines to do so. For this one, again, there's 3 Terminator characters, Typhus again maybe apparently running solo, and then 2 Lords of Contagion to boost the Deathshroud Terminators with their rerolls to hit, one taking that Deadly Pathogen melee upgrade. Then again this one goes very heavy on the Plague Marines. Again there's 3 Biologist Putrefiers plus a Foul Blight Spawn, and they're loaded into 3 Rhinos alongside 6 units of 5 Plague Marines, these ones going for Blight Launcher, Plasma Gun, and then very heavy on the Bubotic weapons as opposed to the heavy Plague weapons apparently. Then there's the Plagueburst Crawler Brigade, which seems to be almost obligatory. These ones interestingly taking the Plague Spitters for some big anti-infantry shooting attacks. Maybe could be attempted to play a bit more aggressive in the right matchups, I guess. That'd be some nasty anti-horde right there. And there's 2 units of Nurglings for objective support. Again, quite a fun and well-balanced list, I think. Finally, for unit focuses, I thought it was well worth taking a look at the Deathshroud Terminators, 125 points for 3 of these guys, and as you've seen in the list so far, they seem to be typically fielded in units of 3 alongside a character in the squad, as that's what allows them to get a -1 to wounds, plus pretty much most of the Death Guard Terminator characters are just pretty efficient full stop. They get a few Torrent anti-infantry 4+ attacks with their Plague Spurt gauntlets, and then some seriously punchy melee with their Man Reapers, 4 attacks at strength 8, AP 2, damage 2, and hitting on 2s. Just overall a very tanky and very dangerous unit, really quite nice with some of the Terminator characters as well, like the Lord of Contagion. They do move incredibly painfully slowly though, so generally probably going to want to come in via deep strike or rapid ingress, though I guess they could be an area denial unit to threaten charges on midfield objectives. Otherwise, for characters besides Typhus and the Lord of Virulence, the Lord of Contagion is one of the most popular choices to play with them. At 80 points, him plus 3 Deathshroud would be just over 200, and that's a really quite a scary unit for that cost. He brings a whole bunch of strength 8 and damage 3 attacks, or some more anti-horde sweeps if needed. And his main special rule allows you to re-roll the hit rolls in melee, which means that if you are fighting against a target where the Deathshroud will be wounding on a 5+, you could just re-roll all the dice and try and fish for a few more auto-wound lethal hit 6s, means it can increase their damage output by more than you might expect. Otherwise, the other very popular one is the Death Guard Sorcerer in Terminator armor. He's 70 points and is quite good value. For less than 30 points more than a standard Deathshroud Terminator, you get an extra couple of wounds, a fairly nasty psychic shooting attack with 2d6 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1, though likely the first time that you use it you might want to use the Pestilent Familiar to get it up to strength 8 and damage 3 for a single round of shooting. That could be a fairly potent Terminator killer. Otherwise, he has some force weapon melee and has a psychic power called Putrescent Vitality. On a 2+, his unit is -1 damage in melee, making the Terminators extra hard to kill there. For 70 points, I think he seems like an all-around good deal, making a Deathshroud unit into a genuinely scary shooting threat the turn that he arrives, as well as providing more Terminator wounds, a little bit more fight, and the -1 damage thing. Overall, it's pretty nice to see Death Guard doing quite so well in 10th edition. Pretty fun to see such a decent variety of units in the armies. Some things do crop up time and again, like the Plagueburst crawlers, but beyond that there do seem to be genuinely different ways to play the faction, going very heavy on armor or very heavy on Plague Marines, and Mortarion is usable but not auto-include. Let me know your thoughts on the list, or any other insights as to how they were played down in the comments below. As always, I'll look forward to any other insights. I'm sure there'll be some subtleties that I might be missing about the list that I've not mentioned. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.